The Accidental President. Part 7, The Reckoning. Setting, the presidential villa, Abuja. The days following the successful strike on Kalu's forces were marked by an uneasy calm. Joshua Odum knew that this lull was only temporary, that Kalu was regrouping, preparing for his next move. The knowledge gnawed at Joshua's thoughts as he worked tirelessly to strengthen the defenses and prepare for the inevitable counterattack. The command center of the presidential villa had become Joshua's second home. He spent long hours there, surrounded by maps, reports, and intelligence briefings, working alongside Adeora and his military advisors to plan the next steps. The weight of leadership bore down on him, but he carried it with unwavering determination. He knew what was at stake, not just his own life, but the future of Nigeria. One morning, as Joshua was reviewing the latest reconnaissance reports, Adeora entered the room, her expression serious. She held a fresh report in her hand, and Joshua could tell from her demeanor that it was not good news. "Joshua, we've just received an urgent message from our scouts in the northern regions," Adeora said, handing him the report. "Kalu's forces are on the move. They've regrouped faster than we anticipated, and they're heading straight for our northern positions. It looks like they're planning a full-scale assault." Joshua's heart sank as he read the report. The enemy forces were massing along the northern border, the numbers overwhelming. Kalu was launching an all-out attack, and it was clear that he intended to break through the defenses and push deep into the territory. "They're not giving us any time to recover," Joshua muttered, his mind racing as he considered their options. "Kalu's trying to overwhelm us before we can reinforce our positions. He's banking on us being too stretched thin to hold the line." Adeora nodded. "He's throwing everything he has at us. If we lose the northern front, he'll have a clear path to the capital. We can't let that happen." Joshua's eyes hardened with resolve. "We won't let it happen. But we need to act fast. Get me Colonel Hassan and Major Okoye on the line. We need to coordinate our defenses and prepare for the worst." Adeora quickly moved to establish the communications, and within minutes, Colonel Hassan and Major Okoye appeared on the video feed, their faces grim but determined. "Colonel, Major, we have a situation," Joshua began, his tone direct. "Kalu's forces are advancing on the northern front. We're looking at a full-scale assault, and our scouts report that the enemy's numbers are overwhelming. We need to hold the line at all costs. What's your status?" Major Okoye spoke first. "Mr. President, we've reinforced our positions as best we can, but we're still stretched thin. The terrain gives us some advantage, but Kalu's forces are well equipped and motivated. We're preparing for a hard fight." Colonel Hassan added, "Our troops are ready to defend the northern front, but we'll need support. If we're going to hold out against Kalu's assault, we'll need every available resource, troops, artillery, air support, everything." Joshua nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "We'll send reinforcements from the capital, but it's going to take time for them to get there. In the meantime, you'll need to hold your positions and do whatever it takes to delay the enemy. Every minute we buy is crucial." Hassan and Okoye exchanged a look, then nodded in unison. "Understood, sir. We'll hold the line," Hassan said firmly. "I'll also reach out to our allies," Joshua continued. "We need to coordinate with them to ensure that Kalu doesn't find a weak spot in our defenses. We're in this together, and we need to stand united." As the meeting ended, Joshua turned to Adeora, who had been listening intently. "Adeora, I need you to handle the coordination with our allies. We need to make sure they're ready to support us. And make sure our supply lines are secure. We can't afford any disruptions." Adeora nodded, already moving to carry out his orders. "I'll take care of it, Joshua. We'll make sure everything is in place." Joshua watched her go, then returned his attention to the map of the northern front. The stakes couldn't be higher. If they lost the north, the entire country could fall into Kalu's hands. Joshua knew that they had to hold the line, no matter the cost. The future of Nigeria depended on it. Setting, the northern outpost, Nigeria. The northern outpost buzzed with activity as soldiers prepared for the coming battle. The air was thick with tension, every man and woman knowing that they were about to face the full might of Kalu's forces. The rugged terrain, which had once seemed like a haven, now felt like a trap, with the enemy closing in from all sides. Major Nnamdi Okoye moved through the ranks, checking on his soldiers, offering words of encouragement where he could. He could see the determination in their eyes, but he could also see the fear. They were outnumbered and outgunned, and they all knew it. But they were ready to fight, ready to defend the land, even if it meant laying down their lives. "Keep your heads up," Okoye called out as he passed a group of soldiers. "We've trained for this, and we know this terrain better than they do. Use it to your advantage. We're going to hold this line, no matter what." The soldiers responded with a cheer, though it was clear that many of them were trying to mask the fear with bravado. Okoye couldn't blame them. They were facing impossible odds, and the prospect of being overrun was all too real. As he reached the command post, Okoye found Colonel Hassan overseeing the final preparations. The colonel was a seasoned veteran, and his calm demeanor in the face of such overwhelming adversity was a source of strength for the men under his command. "Colonel, we've done all we can," Okoye said, his voice steady despite the anxiety gnawing at him. "The men are ready, but we're going to need every bit of support we can get." Hassan nodded, his expression grim. "I know, Major. Reinforcements are on the way, but until they get here, it's just us. We need to hold out as long as we can. If we can delay Kalu's advance, we might be able to buy enough time for the rest of our forces to mount a counterattack." Okoye clenched his fists, feeling the weight of the responsibility on his shoulders. "We'll hold, sir. We have to." The two men exchanged a silent nod of understanding. They both knew what was at stake. They had fought in countless battles before, but this one felt different. It was as if the entire future of Nigeria hung in the balance, and they were the last line of defense. As the final preparations were made, the soldiers took the positions, weapons at the ready. The sun had begun to set, casting long shadows over the mountains. It wouldn't be long now. They could feel it in the air, the calm before the storm. And then, just as the last light of day faded from the sky, the first sounds of the enemy's approach reached their ears. The ground trembled with the rumble of tanks and armored vehicles, the distant sound of marching boots growing louder with each passing second. Colonel Hassan raised his binoculars and scanned the horizon. The enemy was coming, the numbers vast and seemingly endless. But Hassan didn't flinch. He had been in situations like this before, and he knew that the key to victory was to remain calm, to think clearly even when all seemed lost. "Hold your positions," Hassan ordered, his voice calm but firm. "Wait for my command." The soldiers tensed, their eyes fixed on the horizon as the enemy came into view. The tension was palpable, the air thick with anticipation. And then, with a deafening roar, the battle began. Setting, Kalu's forward base, northern Nigeria. General Adisa Kalu watched the unfolding battle from a secure position just behind the front lines. His forces had begun their assault on the northern outpost, the sheer numbers overwhelming the defenders. He could hear the distant sounds of gunfire and explosions, the battle raging with a ferocity that thrilled him. "This is it," Kalu muttered to himself, a cold smile playing on his lips. "This is where it all ends for Odum." Olatunji, standing beside him, was more cautious. "General, the defenders are putting up a stronger resistance than we expected. They know the terrain well, and they're using it to their advantage. We've taken heavy casualties in the initial assault." Kalu's smile faded as he listened to Olatunji's report. He had expected resistance, but he had not anticipated that the defenders would be able to hold out for so long. Still, he was confident in his victory. His forces were overwhelming, and once the defenders were overrun, the path to Abuja would be wide open. "Keep pressing the attack," Kalu ordered, his voice cold and determined. "They can't hold out forever. Once the lines break, we'll sweep through and crush them." Olatunji nodded, though his expression remained tense. He knew that this battle was crucial, and that any misstep could have dire consequences. But he trusted Kalu's leadership, and he knew that they couldn't afford to show any sign of weakness. As the battle raged on, Kalu's forces continued the relentless advance, the tanks and armored vehicles pushing forward through the rugged terrain. The defenders fought valiantly, using the natural cover provided by the mountains and forests to launch ambushes and hit-and-run attacks. But Kalu's forces were unrelenting, the numbers overwhelming. Colonel Hassan and Major Okoye directed the defense with a steady hand, but they knew they were in a precarious position. The enemy was pushing them back, inch by inch, and it was only a matter of time before the lines would be breached. "Hold the line," Hassan shouted over the deafening roar of gunfire and explosions. "We can't let them through." The soldiers responded with a fierce determination, fighting with everything they had. The air was thick with smoke, the ground littered with the debris of battle. The defenders were outnumbered, but they fought with the desperation of men who knew that the lives, and the fate of the country, were on the line. As the battle dragged on, the situation grew increasingly dire. Kalu's forces were closing in on the command post, and the defenders were being pushed to the limits. Hassan knew that they couldn't hold out much longer. They needed reinforcements, and they needed them now. "Major Okoye, where are those reinforcements?" Hassan called into his radio, his voice tense with urgency. "We're still holding, sir, but we're taking heavy fire," Okoye replied, his voice strained. "The reinforcements should be here soon, but we need to hold out until they arrive." Hassan gritted his teeth, feeling the pressure mounting. They were running out of time, and Kalu's forces were relentless. But he couldn't afford to give up. Not now, not when they were so close. "We'll hold, Major," Hassan said, his voice filled with resolve. "We don't have a choice." Setting: the presidential villa, Abuja. Back at the presidential villa, Joshua Odum paced the command center, his mind racing as he monitored the battle in the north. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, and he knew that they were on the brink of disaster. Kalu's forces were pressing their advantage, and the defenders were barely holding on. "Adeora, any word from the reinforcements?" Joshua asked, his voice tight with tension. Adeora shook her head, her expression grave. "They're on the way, but they're still several miles out. It's going to take time for them to reach the front lines." Joshua clenched his fists, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him. They were running out of time. If the reinforcements didn't arrive soon, the northern front would collapse, and Kalu would have a clear path to the capital. "We can't let them fall," Joshua said, his voice filled with determination. "We need to buy them more time." Adeora nodded, already thinking through their options. "We could launch an airstrike on Kalu's forward positions, slow them down and give our forces a chance to regroup. It's risky, but it might be our best shot." Joshua considered her suggestion. An airstrike could indeed slow Kalu's advance, but it would also be a gamble. If the strike failed, it could leave their own forces vulnerable. But they were running out of options, and Joshua knew that they needed to take the risk. "Do it," Joshua ordered. "Coordinate with our air units and target Kalu's supply lines and command centers. We need to disrupt the momentum." Adeora quickly relayed the orders, and within minutes, the air units were mobilizing. Joshua watched the screens, his heart pounding as he waited for the outcome. This was a pivotal moment, a chance to turn the tide of the battle, or to lose everything. Setting: the northern outpost, Nigeria. Colonel Hassan and Major Okoye were locked in a desperate struggle to hold the positions. The enemy was closing in, the tanks and infantry pressing the defenders back toward the command post. The situation was dire, and both men knew that they were running out of time. But then, just as the enemy seemed poised to break through, the sound of jet engines roared overhead. Hassan looked up to see a squadron of fighter jets streaking across the sky, the payloads aimed directly at Kalu's forward positions. "Air support incoming," Hassan shouted to his men, a surge of hope flooding his chest. The jets unleashed the bombs on the enemy lines, the ground shaking as explosions ripped through Kalu's forces. The impact was immediate and devastating. Tanks were obliterated, supply trucks were blown apart, and entire units were thrown into chaos. The defenders cheered as the enemy advance faltered, the momentum shifting in the favor. But Hassan knew that this was only a temporary reprieve. The airstrike had bought them time, but they still needed to hold the line until the reinforcements arrived. "Major Okoye, rally the troops," Hassan ordered. "We need to press our advantage while we can." Okoye moved quickly, rallying the soldiers and directing them to launch a counterattack. The defenders surged forward, taking advantage of the confusion in Kalu's ranks. They hit the enemy with everything they had, pushing them back and retaking lost ground. But Kalu's forces were not easily defeated. They regrouped quickly, and soon the battle was raging once more, the two sides locked in a brutal, deadly struggle. As the minutes ticked by, Hassan could feel the strain on his men. They were exhausted, the numbers dwindling. But they fought on, driven by sheer determination and the knowledge that they were fighting for the country's survival. And then, just as it seemed that the defenders might finally break, the sound of distant engines reached their ears. Hassan's heart leaped as he recognized the sound. It was the reinforcements. A column of tanks, armored vehicles, and fresh troops appeared on the horizon, racing toward the battlefield. The defenders cheered as the reinforcements arrived, the spirits lifted by the sight of the comrades. The reinforcements hit Kalu's forces like a hammer, smashing through the lines and driving them back. The momentum had shifted decisively in favor of the defenders, and Kalu's troops were now the ones in retreat. "Push them back," Hassan shouted, his voice filled with renewed energy. "Don't let them regroup." The battle raged on for another hour, but it was clear that the tide had turned. The combined forces of the defenders and the reinforcements were too much for Kalu's troops, and they began to fall back in disarray. As the sun began to rise over the battlefield, the last of Kalu's forces retreated, leaving behind a landscape scarred by the ravages of war. The defenders, though battered and exhausted, had held the line. They had saved the northern front, and with it, the future of Nigeria. Colonel Hassan stood amidst the wreckage, his heart filled with a mixture of relief and sorrow. They had won, but at a great cost. The ground was littered with the bodies of the fallen, both friend and foe, and the price of victory weighed heavily on him. Major Okoye approached, his face streaked with dirt and sweat, but his eyes shining with the satisfaction of victory. "We did it, sir. We held the line." Hassan nodded, though his expression remained somber. "Yes, we did. But the war isn't over. Kalu will strike again. We need to be ready." Okoye nodded in agreement. "We'll be ready, Colonel. Whatever Kalu throws at us next, we'll be ready." As the soldiers began the grim task of tending to the wounded and recovering the dead, Hassan and Okoye shared a moment of quiet reflection. They had won a significant victory, but they knew that the war was far from over. The battle for Nigeria's future would continue, and they would need to stay vigilant. Setting: Kalu's command center, Nigeria. General Adisa Kalu stared at the reports coming in from the battlefield, his face a mask of cold fury. His forces had been defeated, their advance stopped dead in its tracks. The airstrike had devastated his supply lines, and the reinforcements had shattered his momentum. It was a crushing blow, one that threatened to derail his entire campaign. "Olatunji," Kalu barked, his voice seething with anger. Olatunji entered the room, his face pale. He knew what was coming, and he braced himself for the storm. "What happened?" Kalu demanded, his eyes blazing with fury. "We had them. How did this happen?" Olatunji hesitated, knowing that no answer would satisfy the general. "The airstrike, General. It caught us off guard. And the reinforcements, they were stronger than we anticipated. Our forces were overwhelmed." Kalu's hands clenched into fists, his mind racing with thoughts of revenge. He had been so close to breaking Odum's defenses and taking the north. But now his plans were in shambles, his forces in retreat. "This isn't over," Kalu growled, his voice low and dangerous. "I don't care what it takes, I want Odum crushed. I want him destroyed. Do you understand me?" Olatunji nodded, his expression grim. "Yes, General. We'll regroup and prepare for the next phase. We won't let this defeat stop us." Kalu turned away, his mind already working on his next move. He had been defeated, but he was far from beaten. He would find a way to turn this setback into an opportunity to strike back at Odum and reclaim his power. "This isn't over," Kalu muttered to himself, his eyes burning with determination. "Not by a long shot." Setting: the presidential villa, Abuja. Joshua Odum stood at the large windows of the command center, looking out over the city of Abuja as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon. The night had been long and filled with tension, but the reports coming in from the northern front brought a sense of relief. The battle had been won, Kalu's forces had been repelled, and the northern regions were secure, for now. But Joshua knew better than to let his guard down. Kalu had proven himself to be a tenacious and ruthless enemy. He would not accept defeat easily, and he would undoubtedly strike again. The victory in the north had bought them time, but the war was far from over. Adera approached, holding a fresh stack of reports. Her eyes were tired, but there was a spark of hope in them. "Joshua," she said softly, handing him the reports. "The northern front is holding, and our forces are consolidating the positions. The reinforcements arrived just in time. We've pushed Kalu back, but he won't give up." Joshua took the reports, skimming them quickly. We need to reinforce our defenses and prepare for the next wave. Kalu's been weakened, but he's not out of the fight yet. We can't afford to let him regroup. Adara nodded. I've already ordered additional troops to move north. We'll strengthen our supply lines and ensure that our communication hubs are secure. I've also reached out to our allies, they're sending more support, but it will take time for them to arrive. Joshua appreciated Adara's thoroughness, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Kalu had something else up his sleeve. The general was a master of deception, and Joshua knew that they needed to be ready for anything. Adara, we need to stay one step ahead of Kalu, Joshua said, his voice filled with resolve. We've won a victory, but we can't let our guard down. We need to be proactive, not reactive. If we can anticipate his next move, we might be able to end this war on our terms. Adara agreed. I've been thinking the same thing. We need to gather more intelligence on Kalu's operations, find out where his remaining forces are concentrated and what his next move might be. If we can hit him before he has a chance to strike back, we could force him into a corner. Joshua nodded. Exactly. Let's focus our efforts on gathering as much information as we can. We need to know what Kalu is planning, and we need to know it before he does. As Adara left to carry out his orders, Joshua turned back to the window, his mind racing with thoughts of the days ahead. The victory in the north had given them a glimmer of hope, but the road ahead was still uncertain. Kalu was a dangerous adversary, and Joshua knew that the war would not be won easily. But as he looked out over the city, he felt a renewed sense of determination. The people of Nigeria were counting on him, and he would not let them down. He would see this war through to the end, no matter the cost. Setting: Kalu's command center, Nigeria. General Adisa Kalu sat alone in his command room, the dim light casting long shadows on the walls. The air was thick with tension, the silence broken only by the occasional beep of the monitors displaying the latest battlefield reports. The defeat in the north weighed heavily on him, but his mind was already racing with plans for his next move. Kalu had always been a man of action, a leader who thrived on the chaos of war. But the recent setbacks had forced him to re-evaluate his strategy. Joshua Odum had proven to be a formidable opponent, one who could not be easily outmaneuvered. Kalu knew that he needed to change tactics, to find a way to regain the upper hand. Olatunji entered the room, his expression serious but cautious. He knew that Kalu's temper was volatile, especially after a defeat, but he also knew that the general respected competence and loyalty. General, Olatunji began, his voice measured. Our forces are regrouping, but the situation is dire. We've lost significant ground in the north, and our supply lines have been severely disrupted. It will take time to recover. Kalu's eyes narrowed as he listened. Time is something we don't have, Olatunji. Odum will use this opportunity to press his advantage. We need to strike back before he can consolidate his gains. Olatunji nodded, understanding the urgency in Kalu's voice. We still have strongholds in the east and west. If we can secure those regions, we can launch a counteroffensive. But we'll need to move quickly, before Odum can reinforce his positions. Kalu considered this, his mind working through the possibilities. He knew that a direct assault on Abuja was no longer feasible, not without significant reinforcements. But he also knew that Odum's forces were stretched thin, and that there were weaknesses in the defenses that could be exploited. We'll hit them where they least expect it, Kalu said, his voice cold and calculated. If we can disrupt the supply lines and communications, we can force them into a defensive position. We'll make them fight on our terms. Olatunji raised an eyebrow, intrigued. You're suggesting we launch a series of targeted strikes? Hit-and-run tactics? Kalu nodded. Exactly. We'll weaken them from within, create chaos and confusion, and then strike when they're at the weakest. We've been too focused on large-scale battles, but it's time to change our approach. We'll use deception, subterfuge, and surprise to turn the tide in our favor. Olatunji could see the wisdom in Kalu's plan. It was a departure from the previous strategies, but it played to the strengths, stealth, cunning, and the element of surprise. I'll begin preparations immediately, Olatunji said, his voice filled with renewed determination. We'll target the key infrastructure, disrupt the communications, and force them to spread the forces thin. Kalu's eyes gleamed with a mixture of malice and anticipation. Good. And when the time is right, we'll deliver the final blow. Odum thinks he has us on the ropes, but he's about to learn that the real battle has just begun. As Olatunji left to carry out the orders, Kalu leaned back in his chair, a cold smile spreading across his face. He had been pushed to the brink, but he was not defeated. He had a new plan, one that would catch Odum and his allies off guard. And when the dust settled, Kalu was determined that he would be the one standing victorious. "This war is far from over," Kalu muttered to himself, his voice filled with dark resolve. "And I will see it through to the end." Setting, the northern outpost, Nigeria. The victory at the northern front had brought a brief respite to the defenders, but Major Nnamdi Okoye knew that it was only a matter of time before Kalu struck again. The battle had taken a heavy toll on the forces, and the men were exhausted. But they had held the line, and that was what mattered. As Okoye moved through the ranks, checking on his men, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. They had fought valiantly, standing the ground against overwhelming odds. But he also knew that they couldn't afford to let the guard down. The war was still raging, and Kalu would not stop until he had achieved his goals. "Major," one of the scouts approached, his expression urgent. "We've spotted movement on the eastern flank. It looks like Kalu's forces are regrouping. They're up to something." Okoye's heart sank at the news. He had hoped for more time to regroup, but it seemed that Kalu was determined to keep the pressure on. "Alert the men," Okoye ordered. "We need to be ready for anything. If Kalu's planning another attack, we'll be prepared." The scout nodded and hurried off to relay the orders. Okoye watched him go, his mind already working through the possible scenarios. The battle ahead would be just as fierce as the last, and they needed to be ready for whatever Kalu threw at them. As the soldiers began preparing for the next phase of the conflict, Okoye took a moment to survey the battlefield. The ground was scarred from the previous fighting, the remnants of the battle still visible in the wreckage and debris that littered the landscape. It was a stark reminder of the cost of war, but it also served as a testament to the resilience. "We've come this far," Okoye muttered to himself, his voice filled with determination. "We're not going to let Kalu take this from us. We'll fight, and we'll win." With that resolve, Major Okoye returned to the command post, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The war was far from over, but he knew that they had the strength and the will to see it through to the end. Setting, the presidential villa, Abuja. As the hours passed, Joshua Odum received more reports of Kalu's movements. The general was regrouping, his forces preparing for another round of attacks. But this time, the attacks were different, smaller, more precise, aimed at key infrastructure and supply lines. It was clear that Kalu was changing tactics, and Joshua knew that they needed to adapt quickly. "Adeora," Joshua said, turning to his most trusted advisor, "Kalu's shifting his strategy. He's targeting our supply lines and communication hubs. He's trying to weaken us from within, disrupt our operations before launching a larger offensive attack. We need to counter this immediately." Adeora, who had been closely monitoring the situation, nodded in agreement. "We're seeing increased activity in several regions, small, coordinated strikes that are causing disruptions. If Kalu keeps this up, it could significantly undermine our ability to maintain our defenses and support our troops on the front lines." Joshua's mind raced as he considered their options. Kalu's new strategy was dangerous, but it wasn't without its vulnerabilities. By spreading his forces thin across multiple targets, Kalu was taking a risk. If they could anticipate his moves and counter them effectively, they could turn the tables on him. "We need to strengthen our defenses around critical infrastructure and supply routes," Joshua said decisively. "And we need to do it fast. I want teams deployed to all vulnerable locations with orders to fortify and defend. We also need to set traps, turn his hit-and-run tactics against him." Adeora's eyes brightened with understanding. "We could lay ambushes along the supply routes, draw Kalu's forces into traps where we can overwhelm them. If we can predict where they'll strike next, we can hit them hard and fast." "Exactly," Joshua replied. "And we need to stay flexible. We can't afford to get bogged down in one area. If Kalu is trying to stretch us thin, we need to show him that we can respond quickly and decisively. We'll hit back at every opportunity and keep him off balance." Adeora immediately began relaying orders to the commanders in the field, coordinating the deployment of troops and resources to protect the most vulnerable assets. She also made sure that the intelligence teams were working around the clock to track Kalu's movements and anticipate his next targets. As she worked, Joshua turned his attention to another critical aspect of the defense: morale. Kalu's strategy wasn't just about weakening the physical defenses, it was about sowing fear and uncertainty among the ranks. Joshua knew that they needed to keep the troops motivated and confident, or Kalu's tactics would have the desired effect. He called for a video conference with key commanders and leaders across the country, wanting to address them directly. Setting: across Nigeria, military command posts and allied strongholds. Commanders from various regions appeared on the screen, their expressions tense but attentive. They had all been briefed on the situation and knew how precarious things had become. Joshua's image filled the screens across the command centers, his face resolute. "Commanders," Joshua began, his voice firm and steady, "we're facing a new phase of this war. Kalu is changing tactics, trying to disrupt us from within. But let me be clear, this is not a sign of strength. It's a sign that he's feeling the pressure. We've pushed him back, and now he's trying to weaken us before he crumbles." Joshua's eyes moved across the screen, making direct contact with the men and women who were leading the fight across Nigeria. "We will not be intimidated. We will not be divided. Our strength comes from our unity, our resilience, and our determination to fight for the future of this country. Kalu wants to break us, but we will stand firm. We will protect our supply lines, we will defend our people, and we will strike back at every opportunity." The commanders nodded, their expressions hardening with resolve. Joshua's words were having the desired effect, bolstering the morale and reminding them of what they were fighting for. "We have the advantage," Joshua continued. "We know this land, we know our people, and we know what's at stake. Kalu may have changed his tactics, but that only means he's running out of options. Stay vigilant, stay strong, and remember, we're fighting for something much greater than ourselves. Together, we will win this war." With that, Joshua ended the call, leaving the commanders to return to the posts with renewed determination. Setting: Kalu's command center, Nigeria. General Adisa Kalu watched the live feed from one of his spies embedded within the ranks of Joshua Odum's forces. He had seen Joshua's address to his commanders, and it left a bitter taste in his mouth. Odum's ability to inspire loyalty and hope among his people was frustrating. Kalu had seen it as a weakness, a reliance on sentimentality. Yet, it seemed to work, strengthening the resolve of those who followed Odum. Kalu turned to Olatunji, who had also watched the address. "Odum's morale is unshaken. He's rallying his people, preparing them for what's to come. But we'll see how long that lasts once we've dismantled their infrastructure piece by piece." Olatunji hesitated before speaking. "General, we've had some success with our strikes, but Odum's forces are adapting quickly. They've reinforced the supply lines and are setting ambushes. We've already lost several units to the counterattacks." Kalu's expression darkened. He had expected resistance, but he hadn't anticipated that Odum would be able to respond so effectively. It was becoming clear that a war of attrition might not work in his favor, especially with his resources already stretched thin. "What's the status of our operations in the West?" Kalu asked, shifting his focus. "We've managed to disrupt the communications in several key areas, and our forces are positioned to strike at the logistical hubs," Olatunji reported. "But we'll need to move quickly if we want to maintain the element of surprise. Odum's forces are closing in on our positions." Kalu leaned over the table, his eyes scanning the maps and reports spread out before him. "We need to hit them harder, disrupt their ability to regroup. If we can take out one of the key strongholds, it could force Odum to spread his forces even thinner." He pointed to a location on the map, a critical supply depot near the border with a neighboring country that had been supporting Odum's forces. "This is where we'll strike next. If we can cut off the supplies from the west, it will weaken their ability to defend the north and the capital." Olatunji studied the map and nodded. "It's a high-risk operation, but if we succeed, it could cripple the supply lines." "Then we don't have a choice," Kalu said, his voice cold and calculating. "Prepare the forces. We'll launch the attack under cover of night. I want it swift and decisive." Olatunji saluted and left to carry out the orders, leaving Kalu alone with his thoughts. He knew that time was running out. The war had taken its toll on both sides, but Kalu was determined to see it through to the bitter end. He couldn't afford to lose, not after coming this far. Setting, the Western Front, Nigeria. Night had fallen, and the air was thick with tension as Kalu's forces moved into position near the Western Supply Depot. The area was heavily fortified, but Kalu's forces had managed to infiltrate the region using covert tactics. The plan was simple: a swift, overwhelming attack that would destroy the depot and sever a key supply line for Odum's forces. In the darkness, Kalu's soldiers crept closer to the target, the movements silent and deliberate. They were well-trained, elite troops who had been hand-picked for this mission. As they neared the depot, they readied the weapons and prepared to strike. But unknown to Kalu, Joshua had anticipated this move. His intelligence team had intercepted communication between Kalu's commanders and had set their own trap in response. The depot was defended by more than just soldiers. Hidden defensive positions, tripwires, and automated turrets had been set up to protect the vital supply line. As Kalu's forces launched their attack, they were met with a hail of gunfire and explosions. The automated defenses sprang to life, cutting down the first wave of attackers before they even reached the perimeter. Ambush, one of Kalu's commanders shouted as chaos erupted around them. The once covert operation had turned into a deadly firefight, with Kalu's forces caught in a kill zone. Joshua's forces, hidden in strategic positions around the depot, opened fire with precision, taking out Kalu's troops with brutal efficiency. The element of surprise had shifted, and now Kalu's elite unit was on the defensive, struggling to survive the onslaught. Back at the command post, Major Okoye watched the battle unfold on the monitors, a grim smile on his face. "We've got them right where we want them," he muttered. "They walked right into our trap." The battle raged on for several minutes, but it was clear that Kalu's forces were outmatched. They had been lured into a trap, and now they were paying the price. With the numbers dwindling and the mission in shambles, the remaining attackers began to retreat, leaving behind the dead and wounded. Joshua received the report from Major Okoye, his expression one of satisfaction. "Good work, Major. That should send a clear message to Kalu. We're not going to be easy prey." "We've repelled them for now," Okoye replied, "but we need to stay vigilant. This war isn't over, and Kalu won't stop until he's been dealt with once and for all." Joshua nodded, his mind already turning to the next steps. They had won another victory, but the war was far from over. Kalu was still out there, and he would be more dangerous than ever now that his plans were falling apart. But Joshua knew that they had the upper hand. With every victory, Kalu's forces were weakened, his resources depleted. The time would soon come for a final, decisive strike, one that could end the war and bring peace back to Nigeria. Joshua was determined to be ready for that moment, to seize the opportunity when it presented itself. Setting, Kalu's command center, Nigeria. General Adisa Kalu's face was a mask of barely controlled rage as he received the report of the failed operation at the Western Supply Depot. His elite forces had been decimated, the mission a catastrophic failure. It was supposed to have been a swift, decisive strike, but instead, it had turned into a bloodbath. Joshua Odum had outmaneuvered him once again. Olatunji stood before him, his posture tense as he awaited Kalu's reaction. He knew that this latest defeat would not sit well with the general, and he braced himself for the inevitable outburst. Kalu slammed his fist down on the table, his eyes blazing with fury. How could this happen? We had the element of surprise. How did Odum know? Olatunji swallowed hard before responding, choosing his words carefully. "General, it appears that our communications were compromised. Odum's intelligence team must have intercepted our plans. They were waiting for us." Kalu's anger boiled over. "We've been betrayed from within. Someone is feeding information to Odum, and I want them found, now." Olatunji nodded, knowing that the search for the traitor would become a top priority. But even as he acknowledged the order, he couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. The tide of the war was turning against them, and every move they made seemed to play into Odum's hands. "What do we do now, General?" Olatunji asked, trying to steer the conversation toward action rather than recrimination. "We've taken heavy losses, and our forces are spread thin. We need to regroup and reassess our strategy." Kalu's fury slowly transformed into cold calculation. He knew Olatunji was right, they couldn't afford to keep throwing troops into battles they couldn't win. They needed to find a way to regain the initiative, to take back control of the war. Odum thinks he has won, Kalu said, his voice low and dangerous. He thinks he can outmaneuver us at every turn. But he's made one critical mistake, he underestimates how far I'm willing to go to achieve victory. Olatunji looked at Kalu, his unease deepening. What are you planning, General? Kalu's eyes narrowed, a plan already forming in his mind. We're going to force Odum into a situation he can't control. We'll make him think he's about to win, and then we'll pull the rug out from under him. We'll strike at the heart of his operation, and we'll do it in a way that he never sees coming. Olatunji frowned, trying to follow Kalu's logic. You mean we lure him into a trap? Exactly, Kalu replied, a cruel smile curling on his lips. We'll make him think he's on the verge of victory, let him get comfortable, let him believe that he's outsmarted us. And when he moves in for the kill, we'll spring the trap. We'll turn his own strategy against him. Olatunji hesitated, considering the risks. It was a bold plan, but also a dangerous one. If it worked, it could turn the tide of the war in the favor. But if it failed, it could be the end of Kalu's campaign, and possibly Kalu himself. Are you certain, General? Olatunji asked, his voice cautious. This plan requires precision and timing. If we miscalculate, we won't, Kalu snapped, cutting him off. We can't afford to think like that. This is our last chance to regain control. We're going to make sure Odum walks right into our trap, and when he does, he won't stand a chance. Olatunji nodded, knowing there was no point in arguing further. I'll begin the preparations immediately, General. We'll need to coordinate carefully to ensure everything goes according to plan. Kalu watched Olatunji leave, his mind already racing with thoughts of the upcoming battle. It was a risky move, but Kalu was no stranger to risk. He had built his power through a combination of cunning, ruthlessness, and the willingness to do whatever it took to achieve his goals. This time would be no different. This isn't over, Odum, Kalu muttered to himself, his voice filled with dark determination. You may think you've won, but you're about to find out just how wrong you are. Setting, the presidential villa, Abuja. Joshua Odum sat in the command center, reviewing the latest intelligence reports. The ambush at the Western Supply Depot had been a success, but Joshua knew that Kalu wouldn't take the defeat lying down. The general was dangerous, and Joshua had no illusions about how far Kalu would go to reclaim the upper hand. Adara entered the room, a look of concern on her face. She handed Joshua a report, her expression serious. Joshua, our intelligence team has picked up some disturbing chatter, Adara said. It seems that Kalu is planning something big, something that could change the course of the war. We don't have all the details yet, but it sounds like he's setting a trap for us. Joshua frowned as he read the report. A trap? What do we know? Not much, Adara admitted. Kalu's been careful to keep his plans under wraps. But there's a pattern emerging, he's pulling back his forces in certain areas, almost as if he's inviting us to move in. It's suspicious, to say the least. Joshua's mind raced as he considered the possibilities. Kalu was no fool. If he was pulling back his forces, it was likely to create the illusion of vulnerability. He was trying to lure them into a false sense of security, to make them believe that they were on the verge of victory. We need to be cautious, Joshua said, his voice measured. Kalu's playing a dangerous game, and we can't afford to fall into his trap. We'll need to think carefully about our next moves. Adara nodded in agreement. I've already alerted our commanders to the possibility of a trap. We're reinforcing our positions and making sure we're not overextending ourselves. But if Kalu is planning something, we need to find out what it is, and fast. Joshua knew that time was of the essence. They were on the verge of a decisive moment in the war, but it was crucial that they didn't misstep. Kalu was trying to draw them into a confrontation on his terms, and Joshua couldn't afford to take the bait. We'll need to gather more intelligence, Joshua said. I want our scouts and reconnaissance teams working around the clock. We need to know where Kalu's forces are concentrated, where he's pulling back, and what his objectives are. We'll also need to coordinate closely with our allies. We can't let Kalu divide us. Adara quickly began issuing orders, ensuring that their intelligence operations were stepped up and that communication with their allies was secure. Joshua watched her work, his mind still focused on the challenge ahead. Kalu was playing a dangerous game, but Joshua was determined to outmaneuver him. As the hours passed, reports continued to come in, each one adding a piece to the puzzle. Kalu's movements were becoming clearer, but there were still gaps in their understanding. Joshua knew that the next few days would be critical. One wrong move, and they could find themselves walking into a trap that could spell the end of the campaign. But Joshua also knew that they had the advantage of unity, resolve, and the support of the people. Kalu was a master of deception, but Joshua had something stronger, a cause worth fighting for. "We're going to end this war, Adeora," Joshua said quietly, his voice filled with determination. "But we're going to do it on our terms, not Kalu's." Adeora nodded, her eyes filled with the same resolve. "We'll be ready, Joshua. Whatever Kalu is planning, we'll be ready." Setting, Kalu's forward position, Nigeria. The night was dark, the only light coming from the flickering campfires scattered throughout Kalu's forward base. The atmosphere was tense, the air thick with anticipation as Kalu's troops prepared for the next phase of the war. The plan was in motion, and Kalu was confident that it would lead to Odum's downfall. General Kalu stood at the edge of the camp, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The final battle was approaching, and he could feel it in his bones. Everything he had worked for, everything he had sacrificed, was leading to this moment. He had been pushed to the brink, but he was not defeated. He would never be defeated. Olatunji approached, his expression cautious. "General, the preparations are complete. Our forces are in position, and we're ready to move on your command." Kalu nodded, his gaze still focused on the horizon. "Good. Everything is in place. Now we wait for Odum to take the bait." Olatunji hesitated before speaking again. "General, there's something else. Our spies report that Odum is being cautious, he's not making any sudden moves, and he's strengthening his defenses. He may suspect that we're setting a trap." Kalu's eyes narrowed. "Let him be cautious. It won't change anything. Odum will have no choice but to engage when the time comes. And when he does, we'll be ready for him. He's trying to play it safe, but that won't save him. This war is a game of attrition, and sooner or later, he'll be forced to act." Olatunji nodded, though a part of him remained uneasy. He knew Kalu's plan was bold, perhaps too bold. But he also knew that they were running out of options. If this gambit didn't work, it could mean the end of Kalu's ambitions and, quite possibly, the end of the lives. "Ensure that our forces maintain discipline," Kalu continued, his voice cold and commanding. "No one breaks rank, no one moves without my orders. We need to control the battlefield, dictate the pace of the fight. If Odum hesitates, even for a moment, we'll strike with everything we have." "Yes, General," Olatunji replied. "I'll see to it personally." As Olatunji left to carry out his orders, Kalu remained where he was, his mind focused on the coming confrontation. He knew that this was his last chance to turn the tide of the war. If his plan succeeded, Odum would be forced into a battle on Kalu's terms, with no hope of escape. But if it failed? Kalu shook off the thought. Failure was not an option. He had come too far, fought too hard to lose now. He had built his power on ruthlessness and cunning, and he would use every ounce of that to ensure his victory. "This war will end on my terms," Kalu muttered to himself, his voice a low growl. "Odum won't know what hit him." Setting, the presidential villa, Abuja. As the hours ticked by, Joshua Odum continued to receive updates from his intelligence team. The picture of Kalu's strategy was becoming clearer. He was pulling back in some areas, concentrating his forces in others. But the exact nature of Kalu's plan remained elusive. Adeora returned to the command center, her expression serious. "Joshua, we've confirmed that Kalu is regrouping his forces in several key regions. It looks like he's preparing for a major offensive, but we're still not sure where or when he'll strike." Joshua's brow furrowed as he studied the latest reports. "Kalu is trying to lure us into a trap. He wants us to think he's vulnerable, that we can push him back. But we know better. We need to be cautious, but we can't let him dictate the terms of this war." Adeora nodded. "We need to be proactive. If we can anticipate his move, we might be able to turn the tables on him. But it's risky. We're dealing with incomplete information, and one wrong move could play right into his hands." Joshua understood the gravity of the situation. They were walking on a tightrope, trying to balance caution with the need to act. But he also knew that hesitation could be just as dangerous as rushing in blindly. Kalu was a master of manipulation, and Joshua had no intention of falling into his trap. "Let's focus on fortifying our most critical positions," Joshua said after a moment of thought. "We'll strengthen our defenses and keep our forces mobile. If Kalu wants to draw us into a confrontation, we'll make sure we're ready for it. And we'll continue gathering intelligence. Every bit of information we can get might make the difference." Adara agreed. "I'll coordinate with our field commanders and ensure that we're prepared for any eventuality. And I'll keep pushing our intelligence teams to dig deeper into Kalu's plans." Joshua gave her a nod of approval, then turned his attention back to the map of Nigeria that dominated the center of the room. The war had taken its toll on the country, but he knew that they were nearing a turning point. Kalu was desperate, and desperate men are dangerous. But they are also prone to mistakes, and Joshua was determined to capitalize on any mistake Kalu made. "Stay sharp," Joshua reminded his team as they continued the work. "We're not just fighting to win this war, we're fighting to rebuild our country. Kalu is a threat, but he's not invincible. We'll find a way to outmaneuver him, and when we do, we'll end this once and for all." Setting: the Eastern Outpost, Nigeria. At one of the key strongholds along the Eastern Front, Major Nnamdi Okoye stood with his binoculars raised, scanning the horizon for any signs of enemy movement. The landscape was eerily quiet, the calm before the storm. The men under his command were tense, but disciplined, ready for whatever came the way. The Eastern Outpost was one of the regions where Kalu's forces had concentrated, and Okoye knew that it was only a matter of time before the battle reached them. The recent ambushes and small skirmishes had been a prelude, but the main assault was still to come. "Major, we've got movement on the ridge," one of the scouts reported, his voice low and steady. "Looks like Kalu's forces are repositioning, could be a feint, or they might be preparing for a full-scale attack." Okoye's jaw tightened as he considered the report. "Keep an eye on them, and don't engage unless you have to. We need to know what they're planning before we commit our forces." The scout nodded and returned to his position, leaving Okoye to ponder the next move. The Eastern Front was a critical area. If they lost control here, Kalu would have a direct path to some of the most vital supply routes. Okoye knew they couldn't afford to be caught off guard. He reached for his radio, contacting the command center in Abuja. "This is Major Okoye. We've spotted enemy movement on the eastern ridge. Requesting additional reconnaissance to confirm their intentions. We're holding our position for now." Adeora's voice came through the radio, calm and measured. "Understood, Major. We're dispatching a reconnaissance team to your location. Stay vigilant. We have reason to believe Kalu is trying to lure us into a trap." "We're aware," Okoye replied. "We won't move until we're sure of their intentions. But if they make a move, we'll be ready." As he ended the transmission, Okoye turned to his second-in-command, Captain Adebayo, who had been silently observing the situation. "Captain, make sure the men are prepared for anything. If Kalu is planning to strike, we need to be ready to respond." Captain Adebayo nodded. "The men are on high alert, sir. We won't let them take us by surprise." Okoye knew that they were in for a tough fight, but he had faith in his men. They had faced overwhelming odds before, and they had come through. But this time, they were up against an enemy who was growing increasingly desperate, and that made Kalu's forces all the more dangerous. As the night wore on, Okoye remained at his post, watching the horizon and waiting for the inevitable. The tension in the air was palpable, the anticipation of battle hanging over them like a dark cloud. But Okoye was determined to hold the line, no matter what Kalu threw at them. "We've come this far," Okoye muttered to himself, his voice filled with quiet determination. "We're not going to let Kalu take this from us." Setting: Kalu's forward position, Nigeria. General Kalu's forces had spent days repositioning, pulling back in some areas and concentrating in others. The preparations had been meticulous, the plan carefully crafted to draw Joshua Odum's forces into a decisive confrontation. Now everything was in place. Kalu stood with Olatunji, overlooking the battlefield from a high vantage point. The moon cast an eerie glow over the landscape, the silence broken only by the distant sounds of soldiers preparing for battle. It was the calm before the storm, and Kalu relished it. "This is it," Kalu said quietly, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon. "Odum thinks he's being cautious, but he's already playing into our hands. Once he commits his forces, we'll strike with overwhelming force. Olatunji's expression was one of cautious optimism. We've positioned our reserves to reinforce the main assault. If Odum takes the bait, we'll have him surrounded before he realizes what's happening. Kalu nodded, his mind already envisioning the battle to come. He had planned every detail, every move, and counter-move. He was determined that this would be the battle that broke Odum's forces once and for all. Signal the advance, Kalu ordered, his voice filled with cold determination. Let's end this. Olatunji saluted and left to relay the order. Within moments, Kalu's forces began to move, their advance hidden by the darkness and the terrain. The trap was set, and now all that remained was for Odum to step into it. Kalu watched as his troops advanced, his heart filled with anticipation. He had been waiting for this moment, the culmination of all his plans. This was the final gamble, the move that would either secure his victory or end his ambitions for good. This is where it ends, Odum, Kalu muttered to himself, a dark smile spreading across his face. One way or another, this is where it all ends. Setting, the eastern outpost, Nigeria. As dawn approached, the tension at the eastern outpost reached a breaking point. Major Okoye and his men had been on high alert throughout the night, watching and waiting for any sign of an enemy attack. The scouts reported increased movement on the ridges, and the uneasy silence was heavy with the anticipation of battle. Stay sharp, Okoye ordered his men as they maintained the defensive positions. He could feel it in his gut, something was about to happen. Kalu's forces were closing in, and the lull in the fighting was just the prelude to a storm. The stillness of the night was almost suffocating, as if the very air was bracing itself for the chaos to come. Suddenly, the distant sound of artillery fire shattered the silence. Explosions lit up the horizon, and the ground shook with the force of the blasts. Kalu's forces had begun their assault, and they were coming with everything they had. Incoming, a soldier shouted as the first shells began to fall on the outpost. The defenders scrambled for cover, hunkering down behind sandbags and hastily constructed barricades as the enemy bombardment intensified. Return fire, Okoye commanded, his voice cutting through the chaos. Hold your positions and don't let them push us back. The soldiers responded immediately, the training and discipline kicking in as they fired back at the advancing enemy. The air was filled with the deafening roar of gunfire and the sharp cracks of sniper rifles as the defenders fought to repel the attackers. Through the smoke and haze, Okoye could see Kalu's troops advancing in waves, the silhouettes barely visible against the fiery backdrop of the battlefield. They were well coordinated, the movements calculated and precise. It was clear that Kalu had thrown his best troops into this assault, determined to break the eastern front and open a path to the heart of Nigeria. We've got heavy armor moving in on the west flank, Captain Adebayo reported, his voice strained as he relayed the information. They're trying to outflank us. Okoye swore under his breath. If Kalu's forces managed to outflank them, the entire outpost could be overrun. They needed to hold the line and prevent the enemy from gaining the upper hand. Redirect our anti-tank units to the west, Okoye ordered. We need to take out those tanks before they breach our defenses. As the battle raged on, Okoye moved from position to position, coordinating the defense and keeping his men focused. The enemy was relentless, but the defenders were holding strong, the determination unshaken. The first wave of Kalu's assault met stiff resistance. The defenders' artillery and anti-tank units took a heavy toll on the enemy armor, while the infantry held the ground in fierce close-quarters combat. Kalu's forces, though well-equipped and determined, found themselves mired in a bloody stalemate. But Kalu was not one to be easily deterred. He had anticipated resistance and had prepared accordingly. As the first wave faltered, a second, larger wave of troops began to move in, supported by additional artillery and airstrikes aimed at softening up the defenders' positions. We've got incoming air support from the north, a soldier yelled, pointing to the sky where enemy attack helicopters were closing in, the rotors slicing through the air. Take cover, Okoye shouted, his voice hoarse from the smoke and dust that filled the air. He knew they were in trouble. If those helicopters got through, they would wreak havoc on the outpost. As the enemy helicopters descended, unleashing the deadly payloads on the defenders below, Okoye's heart sank. The situation was becoming increasingly desperate, and they were in danger of being overrun. But just as it seemed that all hope was lost, the sky erupted in a dazzling display of anti-aircraft fire. The defenders had called in their own air support, and friendly fighter jets roared overhead, engaging the enemy helicopters in a fierce dogfight. The tide of the battle began to turn as the enemy helicopters were taken out one by one, exploding in midair and crashing to the ground in fiery wrecks. The defenders cheered as the threat from above was neutralized, the spirits lifted by the sight of their allies fighting alongside them. Okoye seized the moment, rallying his troops for a counterattack. "Now's our chance. Push them back." The defenders surged forward, taking the fight to Kalu's forces with renewed vigor. The battle was fierce and brutal, but the defenders fought with everything they had, refusing to give an inch of ground. Meanwhile, back at Kalu's forward command, the general watched the battle unfold with a mixture of frustration and anticipation. His plan was working. Odum's forces were being drawn into a full-scale engagement, just as he had intended. But the defenders were proving more resilient than he had expected, and the battle was far from the quick victory he had hoped for. "General, our forces are encountering stiff resistance," Olatunji reported, his voice tense. "The defenders are holding the ground, and our losses are mounting. We might need to commit our reserves if we want to break through." Kalu clenched his jaw, his eyes narrowing as he considered his options. He had hoped to avoid deploying his reserves so early, but it was becoming clear that the battle would not be won without them. He couldn't afford to let Odum's forces regroup or launch a counterattack of their own. "Do it," Kalu ordered, his voice cold and decisive. "Deploy the reserves and throw everything we have at them. I want that outpost taken by nightfall." Olatunji saluted and quickly relayed the orders, knowing that the next few hours would be crucial. The reserves, Kalu's last major force, began to move toward the front lines, ready to deliver the final blow that would crush the defenders and secure the eastern front. Back at the outpost, Major Okoye and his men braced themselves for the onslaught. The enemy was throwing everything they had at them, and it was clear that this would be the decisive battle for control of the eastern region. "We're not giving up this position," Okoye shouted to his men, his voice filled with determination. "We've fought too hard and lost too much to let them take it now. Hold the line and push them back." The defenders responded with a fierce battle cry, the resolve unbroken despite the overwhelming odds. They knew that this was the fight that would determine the fate of the country, and they were determined to see it through to the end. As the enemy reserves closed in, the battle intensified to a level of brutality that neither side had experienced before. The ground was churned to mud by the constant shelling, the air thick with the smell of smoke, blood, and cordite. The sound of gunfire, explosions, and the screams of the wounded filled the air, creating a nightmarish symphony of war. But the defenders held on, the determination turning what should have been a swift defeat into a grueling, attritional struggle. Okoye could feel the strain on his men, but he also saw the fear in the eyes of the enemy as they realized they were facing an opponent who would not break. And then, just as it seemed the battle had reached a stalemate, a new sound filled the air, the deep, resonant thrum of heavy artillery. Okoye's heart leaped as he recognized the sound. It was the reinforcements, long-range artillery and heavy armor units that had finally arrived to bolster the defense. "Reinforcements are here," a soldier shouted, his voice filled with hope. The arrival of the heavy artillery turned the tide once more. The defenders, now reinforced and rearmed, launched a ferocious counterattack that caught Kalu's forces off guard. The enemy ranks, already battered by the long battle, began to waver under the renewed assault. Okoye seized the moment, leading his men in a charge that pushed the enemy back from the brink of the defenses. The tide was turning in the favor, and for the first time, Kalu's forces were on the defensive. Kalu, watching from his command post, saw his carefully laid plans unraveling before his eyes. The reserves, his last hope for a decisive victory, were being pushed back, their advance halted by the relentless defenders and the newly arrived reinforcements. "This can't be happening," Kalu muttered, his voice filled with disbelief. We had them. Olatunji, sensing the gravity of the situation, approached Kalu with caution. "General, we need to withdraw. If we stay here, we risk losing everything." Kalu's hands trembled with rage as he watched the battle slipping away from him. He had been so close to breaking Odum's forces and securing his victory. But now, he was faced with a choice: retreat and live to fight another day, or risk everything in a battle that was quickly turning against him. With a snarl of frustration, Kalu made his decision. "Order the retreat," he spat, his voice filled with venom. "Pull our forces back and regroup. This isn't over." Olatunji quickly relayed the order, and Kalu's forces began a hasty retreat, the ranks in disarray as they pulled back from the battlefield. The defenders, seeing the enemy withdrawing, let out a triumphant cheer, the voices echoing across the blood-soaked plains. As the dust settled and the smoke cleared, Major Okoye surveyed the battlefield, his heart swelling with pride and relief. They had done it, they had held the line, repelled the enemy, and won the battle for the Eastern Front. But he also knew that this was just one victory in a long and brutal war. There would be more battles to come, and the fight for Nigeria's future was far from over. Back at the presidential villa in Abuja, Joshua Odum received the news of the victory with a mixture of relief and resolve.